Most of us have watched the Olympics, either all or in part, at some point during our life. But have you ever wondered what it takes to get there? Or what it feels like to be there? And what does it feel like to compete? And how about when your entire career boils down to 5.5 minutes? What do you do when those minutes are up? Where do you go from there? Well, today we're going to find out as I speak to a gentleman who competed in the 2016 Games. Welcome to Beyond the Lens and my interview with Hans Struzyna. Hi, Hans. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us, how did you get into rowing in the first place?
Gosh, as you can imagine, it's not a super common sport, but I grew up in the Seattle area, and that is one of the hubs of rowing. And one of our family friends, this was back when I was a freshman in high school, mentioned to my parents that they could take private rowing lessons as a family at Lake Sammamish, which is kind of near where Microsoft is headquartered, for those of you who are not familiar. And so we did. And just as like a summer activity, we thought it would be fun to go and try going out on the lake together and just, paddling around and seeing what it was all about. And from there, I just kind of kept going, joined the rec team, joined the competitive team, and took the ride.
So where along the way did the Olympics become a goal?
It wasn't for a while. So the way that I generally viewed my rowing career, especially in the first half of it, was always trying to make the next jump, whatever that was. So when I first started, it was just trying to make the JV, because that was the stretch goal my first year, and then trying to make the varsity, and then trying to be recruited to college and set fitness standards. We do indoor rowing on the rowing machine that a lot of CrossFit people might know. And I would always just try and set incremental improvements there, and then get to college, make the first boat, make the varsity boat, et cetera, et cetera. And it really wasn't until probably my sophomore year in college that I realized that not only was I competitive with a lot of the guys on the team, but I was actually able to beat them in the very top group, and ended up making the varsity that won the national championship that year. And our team pulls talent, the University of Washington pulls talent from around the world. And so we literally had people who had been on their own respective national teams and Olympic teams that I was competitive with. So that was kind of the moment when I was like, this could be a goal.
Now, talk to me a little bit about that. What's the different mindset between you and your personal journey with this, as opposed to also being a part of a team?
Yeah, rowing is funny because you literally, as a team, you literally sit in the same boat. And so regardless of how fast or slow someone is individually, the boat's going a certain speed, right? So for the psychology of the season is very much every person for themselves, so to say, in that everyone's trying to improve their fitness times and improve their times on the water, their technical abilities. So there's a lot of like ranking and pecking order that goes up and down, especially through the fall and the winter and into the early spring. And through all of that, there's sort of a natural selection that happens, and sort of a natural ranking that happens, but there's also some very measured and precise rankings that happen along the way as well. And by the early spring, which we're talking kind of April-ish, for a June national championship, you've got pretty much a pretty solid group of guys or girls together in a boat, who then have to kind of gel and become greater than the sum of their parts. So it's very individual based up into then, and then it becomes very like, how does this group of 8 rowers come together to be a team, where just a month or two before they were trying to beat each other.
So when you head to the Olympics, are you heading individually and become part of an Olympic team, or are you heading as a team?
You go as a team. There are multiple boat classes. So what's unique about rowing is it's all one length of the race is one length, as opposed to swimming or track. But the number of people in a boat is what changes, and so the way you row it and the dynamic is unique in that way. But the way you make it into one of those boats is really individual. There's a track where you go join a training center. You usually have to get invited or qualify to be part of that training center, or you can go to the trials. Basically, you show up and you race anybody else that shows up in that boat class, and if you win, then you basically get to go. It's not quite that simple, but that's more or less how it works. And when I went, I was invited to be part of the training center, and through the selection process and all the racing and all the stuff we did, what made it onto the men's 8 and was named to that team. When well, the one thing, it wasn't, well, I was named into the boat, and then the boat hadn't qualified its spot to go to the Olympics yet. So you get, or each boat class is given a certain number of entries based on the finishes from the World Championships the year before, and we were just outside of that as a country. And so we went in May to Lucerne, Switzerland, to race at the Last Chance Regatta, and there were 5 crews that showed up. Top 2 get the last 2 spots to go to the Olympics. And we won that race, and there were 3 boats within a quarter of a second of each other. And
Oh,
we were
wow.
fortunate to come up on top on that one. So that's how we actually got to be part of the team officially.
Wow. So once you start to train for the Olympics, how does your training change, or how is it different than the training that you were used to up to then?
Well, one big thing is you really think of it in a quadrennial, so 4-year chunks. And so the year immediately following the previous Olympics is the post-Olympic year, obviously, and it's traditionally the least competitive, because the veterans often take a year off or take some time off to recover, to sort of spend some time with their families. So you often get a lot of the newer guys, gals coming in and trying to make those teams for experience. And then as you get further through the quadrennial, so in our case, 2013 was that year. And then as you kind of ramp through the year, it gets more and more competitive. The more of the veterans come back. The training programs continue to ramp up. So people, and in 2015, all of the Olympic qualification spots are up for grabs. So it's really sort of crescendoing through the 4-year cycle. So for me, I had to work. So I was in some sales jobs before, in the early part of the year, and was training full time. So I was trying to work as flexibly as I could and train twice a day. And then by the end, I had to stop working. So I think the last 18-ish months leading up to the games, I didn't work. I just trained 100%.
Wow. So tell us, because none of us will ever, well, very few of us anyway, will ever get to experience this. Tell us what it feels like to sit in the boat and compete. What does it feel like? What does it sound like?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things you notice in international competition is when you go up to the start line, they do what's called pulling the crews. And that basically means you go line up in your lane, and you back the boat up to the someone who's holding a stake boat, so that they put your bow ball right on the start line. And then once everyone's locked in and ready, they'll go through the lanes progression, usually 1 through 6, and they'll say the name of the crew. And in college or in high school, you're thinking, oh, Sammamish Rowing Association or University of Washington, like you're rowing for your school. But in international competition, it's United States of America, Germany, Croatia, Italy, it's country names. It like has a different gravity to it. So right there, it's just the same thing, but it like all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this is happening. We're doing this at the high level. And then from there, it's quiet. There's no sound, and then they have a red light, turns to green light, there's a sound, and then it's like an explosion happens, and you're trying to burst out of the gate, get your boat to speed as quickly as possible. And it's just loud and chaotic, and everyone's just trying to kind of stay at the pace of the moment. So that's about 20 or 30 strokes worth, and then you eventually will settle down into more of a bass cadence, bass rhythm, and then you're hunkering in for the next 3 or 4 minutes before you sprint to the finish line.
Wow. Meanwhile, you have some guy yelling at you most of the time.
Yeah. In the 8 you do at the Olympic program, that's the only boat that has a coxswain, and that's a small person. I think they have to be around 125 pounds. There's a weight minimum, and there's no maximum technically, but strategically you don't want anyone carrying extra weight. Mm-hmm. But they are literally steering the boat. They have a connection to a rudder, so they're keeping you straight in the lane. And then they also have a microphone, so that they are calling the race plan, calling the cadence, doing certain things that you've sort of planned on, so that the whole crew is on the same page with what's happening and where you are. In the smaller boat classes, you don't have that coxswain. So, but that's also practically it's easier to yell up and down a 4 or a 2-person boat than it is an 8-person boat.
Mm. And when we see it on television, we see a very small chunk of what really goes on. So tell me, you went to Rio, and tell me about some of what goes on that we don't see.
Yeah, the thing that I tell most people is when they watch on NBC, especially in the United States, it's all trumpets and it's pageantry and excitement. And when you're in the Olympic Village, or just in the experience of it, it's not that it's not that, because there's Olympic flags and logos everywhere. But generally, when you're in the dining hall or walking around in the Olympic Village, you're sort of surrounded by people who are at the same level as you in their given sport, and everyone's just trying to sort of act normal. And it's so there's not so much the fanfare and the crazy hype and all of that, until people get out to their competitions and to the practice facilities and all of that stuff. But it's very mundane, actually. It's really, you're trying to recover, you're going and eating properly, you're resting, you're spending a lot of time off your feet, laying down, getting PT work or massage or whatever you need, staying hydrated. It's actually pretty Spartan and boring, until you go and compete, because you're looking for those quarter, 10th of percent advantages, or way to recover or something like that. And it's a real it's a really weird dichotomy all of a sudden.
So when you're there and you have people from all over the world, is there an underlying sense of camaraderie, so to speak, because you're all there and you're getting to experience this? Or is there an underlying sense of competition, or a little of both?
Yeah, well, there's 10,000 beds in the Olympic Village, so there's a ton of different athletes, obviously. Different sports, different sizes, different heights and weights and all that stuff. And there's generally sort of a mutual respect, especially in the village and on the buses to and from the venues, that everyone's just trying to do their thing and compete and do their best and all that. So there's this a high level of that. Of course, there's posturing, especially when people are in your event. You're all trying to sort of walk near each other, and there's some of that going on. But I felt generally there's like a sense of, like, especially on the United States team, like, go USA, we're all supporting each other, we're in this together kind of thing. And generally there's outside of your team in your country, there's a lot of folks who are just trying to do their best and trying not to get in your way, and you're doing the same. So there's a lot of respect, I think, in that way. That's one of the things I felt that I was sort of surprised by.
So as you just mentioned, there are thousands of athletes there, but each event only has 3 spots on a podium. So what is And if I remember correctly, your team came in fourth.
We did.
So,
Just missed it.
so what does that feel like, and what happens to you mentally when that occurs?
Well, regardless of the way anybody finishes, there's a huge sense of relief, because you've just been building and building to this moment. And now that it's over, there's sort of like a, a lifting of pressure. Like my dad got remarried when I was training, and the woman that he married, his name is Deb, told me after the fact, after I came home and was decompressing from the whole thing. She's like, I feel like I actually know you now, because when I met you all those times previously, you had like a shield up. And that's really how I operated. Like I could barely let anything or anyone in, because I was just so focused on this thing. So there's absolute pressure relief when you're done, regardless of that. That being said, everyone goes there to do well, to make the A final, to win a medal. And when you don't, there is an overwhelming sadness and disappointment,
Mhm.
along with that relief, that is hard to describe. And everyone handles it differently. For me, it took me quite a while to get to a point where I could accept that the result of that did not need to define my whole 12-year career. But for a long time, I saw that as a total failure, and it really took some coaching and some therapy and a lot of self-work to dig out of that hole, and to really provide context of the whole experience, as opposed to 5.5 minutes of a 12-year rowing career.
Mm. So that happens, and so now the Olympics are over. You have this emotion to deal with. What does after look like? And are you ever really prepared along the way for after, mentally, or
Uh,
is it something that you just deal with when it comes?
uh, I can't speak for everybody, but personally, I don't think anyone is uh, prepared for it. I certainly wasn't. Like, to give you context, like I never conceptualized September of 2016 hitting the calendar. I absolutely never thought about 2017, like the year, even. Like it just didn't cross my mind, because everything was building to August of 2016. For 4, 5, 6 years previously, it was all about that moment in time. And the sun sets, and then the sun comes up the next day, and there you are. So for me, it it was really bizarre, and I don't know that I can really explain it to someone who hasn't been there, but it was just a paradigm shift of like, oh, the sun is still coming up, and I still have to go on with my life and go do something else, because I was only 27 at the time. And I had plans. Of course, I had things I wanted to try and do, and potentially go back to rowing, potentially start a career. But in that initial moment, when it was so raw, it was not a situation that I could just hop into. And I certainly didn't have a plan or a thought of what I wanted to do.
Did you have a little bit of an identity crisis?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When your identity, like what I did, was tied up in your performance in rowing, and the last however many years of your life, in my case 12, you spent honing this craft and building an identity around being a winner in rowing, and then you go and you do what you perceive as a failure, you know that just rattled me to my core. Like, what else? Like, if I can't even succeed at this, what else am I going to succeed at? Which I know sounds crazy in retrospect, but that's how I felt. And if you then don't have rowing, what do you have? Which I've since learned I have a lot of other stuff to offer, and that wasn't an overnight realization, but definitely one that everyone goes through and has to go through on their own terms.
I know in your podcast you talk a lot about shifts and
Mm-hmm.
pivoting and things like that. And I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in one thing or being one thing
Mm-hmm.
that like you were just saying that you were no longer an Olympian, you were no longer a rower, you weren't a winner, but I challenge the fact that you are still all of those things,
Yep.
just in a different way.
Yep. And that's something that I'm still going through to some degree. And the I've sort of made peace with the Olympics, and I've decided what the experience meant to me, and it won't, and I'm not letting it be defined by the results of 5.5 minutes of competition, because I met just some of the most amazing people. I've traveled to, I don't know, 30 countries and competed in many of them. I, lived in all different parts of this country, met some amazing people, built some unbelievable relationships. I was the best man in the wedding from a guy from Belgrade, Serbia, and he was my roommate in college for 3 years. Like, when would that have ever happened otherwise? Stuff like that you have to be willing to accept, like, all the amazing stuff that happens, even if, like, the one goal at the end you don't realize, because the journey along the way was awesome.
Right. And even when you think about the enormity of some of what you just said, you had a 12-year career that boiled down to 5.5 minutes.
Yep.
And so what do you think you learned from rowing, or this whole experience, that you will always carry with you?
Several things, certainly. One is that I am capable of being uncomfortable and putting myself in an uncomfortable position and still performing. So that now that I'm in my real estate career, and we're in a tense negotiation, physically, some people respond to that with discomfort. The uncertainty, the nervousness, the pressure, like that part, it affects me, but I know how to handle it. And so that's a huge one for me. But also just the ability to perform at a high level, be part of a team, and break problems down and see them as opportunities to overcome as opposed to obstacles.
That's great. Well, one last question, Hans. If you could go back and talk to the guy that began this journey, knowing what you know now, what would you tell him?
That it's okay to relinquish control of the things you can't control.
Interesting. You want to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah. I was, as a young person, I grew really late, and I struggled in school and needed some extra help, which for a long time, and still to this day to some degree, I hold on to that identity of myself. And I'm now in the process of, like, changing what that whole experience meant. And to be fair, like, that person drove me and built a work ethic and a drive to be someone who could go to the Olympics and make the USA Olympic team. But I still held on to that version of myself. And until recently, actually in the last couple of days, I've been doing some really deep journaling and thoughts on this, and recognizing that, like, I couldn't control when my growth spurt came along. I couldn't control when my that I had a learning issue, and I couldn't, the traditional classroom work didn't click for me for whatever reason as a 8-year-old or whatever I was. And being okay and accepting that, and then using what I could control to my advantage, which was, like, I just have to work in a different way, work a little harder, work a little smarter, and change the identity around that stuff, because none of us can control if coronavirus comes into the world, or if we get a deal falls apart, or a client leaves us or whatever. But we can control how we respond, and what we choose to assign it meaning, what meaning we choose to assign to that situation.
That's great. And if anyone wants to follow you, get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so on Instagram, I'm Chief Snah, SNAH, which is my first name backwards. And if you, I also have a podcast, which, Marlana, you've been a guest on, and a great guest at that, called Another Way to Play. So that's available on iTunes and all the other places where podcasts are available. And then my website is hansstruzyna.com. which is struzyna.com. And I got a lot about my podcast and my journey and my story up there as well.
Great. And we will put all that in the show notes as well. Thank you so very much, Hans. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
My job as a photographer is to see things in a different way, to create reactions, to frame what is seen so we can better understand. Here we take a look beyond the lens of what we may think we see or know about people, events, and situations. To subscribe, please join my mailing list, visit my YouTube channel, or look for Beyond the Lens on Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple. I'm honored by the people I work with. If you'd like to talk about shaping the way you are seen in photographs, please schedule a call. I'd love to hear from you.